Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for March 29th, 2023. Today I'm going to be discussing the fraud of Western democracy. Now let me begin by simply saying that those of you who are writing to me to tell me that we're not a democracy in the United States but a republic, I know. We're a republic where we have institutions of self-government, which supposedly people democratically vote to choose the representatives. However, to discuss democracy in the way the Western nations are doing now is an absolute fraud. You might say it's a situation comedy. If you look at the points I'm going to make for you in a minute, this online summit for democracy, it's really how the extended NATO operation of the US, the United Kingdom, and Europe intends to rule the planet. Now, it's an unbelievable farce, but it's not funny. After the first one, I wrote an article, which is linked below, on calling it the Summit for Hypocrisy. But one of my associates maybe came up with a better term. He called it Submit for Democracy. So the farce merely confirms how prescient the Greek philosopher Plato was when he warned that so-called democracy is often a pathway to tyranny. And that's why you can see LaRouche organizers in the street with signs that say Plato, not NATO. So let's just run through some of the examples of what the so-called democratic West are doing in the name of democracy. How they're lecturing governments, how they're demanding that they be supported without even allowing a real uncensored debate. So let's start with the war against Russia by NATO. Look at the points here. First of all, there was a long-term refusal over 8 years to negotiate with Russia over its legitimate security concerns. That's what ultimately led to what is called the unprovoked invasion, or what the Russians called the special military operation. Now, this refusal to negotiate was backed up by constant lies, lying about eastward expansion of NATO. The Russians were promised there'd be no eastward expansion, and yet it has continued without end up to the very borders of Russia. Lying about fulfilling the Minsk Accord, which was supposedly going to solve the problem in the Donbass, where the Ukrainian forces were shelling and killing the population that resisted the coup in February 2014. Merkel, Hollande, Poroshenko, all of them admitted that they lied. And why did they lie? To buy time for a military buildup for Ukraine to fight Russia. So, since when did lying become a part of democracy? Well, apparently a long time ago. Rejecting negotiations for a ceasefire or an end to the war. The Chinese have made a peace proposal. The United States has ruled out any discussion of this, saying it's, quote, unacceptable. That's democratic. And demanding that allies support arms and funds for the Ukrainian government, which, by the way, is not a democracy. It's suppressed opposition forces, shut down newspapers. You have Nazis in key positions in defense and security institutions, on top of which you have the Committee to Combat Disinformation, which threatens journalists who report honestly on the situation in Ukraine, calling them information terrorists and putting them on a kill list. I'm someone who's on that kill list. And then, of course, you have support for sanctions, which are a form of war crime conducted against people of nations who are targeted because they won't submit to the rules-based order. Then you have Blinken, who's an out-front spokesman for so-called democracies and his rules-based order. Listen to his quote. I've used this the last couple of days, but it's really crucial to get a sense of what's going on in his mind. He said, "We have had little success to persuade or compel China to abide by American rules." Why should China be forced to abide by American rules if those rules are harming other populations, including the American population? That's what the rules-based order, which they're trying to promote through this submit to democracy policy. Now then you have Samantha Power, who is the promoter of the responsibility to protect, which is essentially a form of funding so-called democratic forces to carry out regime change operations, including against democratically elected governments. She was recently in Hungary because she and her EU compatriots didn't like the fact that the Hungarian people overwhelmingly voted to return Orban as president of Hungary. She's going to give a lecture on the rule of law. Well, the rule of law in the mind of Samantha Power and her murderous sidekick Victoria Nuland obviously includes overthrowing democratically elected governments. Then you have Deputy U.S. Attorney General Lisa Monaco bragging about how the U.S. is moving to shut down TikTok, cut off access to TikTok, for fears that it's a Chinese spy operation. Well, the Chinese obviously need more than just balloons to spy on the U.S., according to these so-called Democrats. Then you have the Netherlands, one of the EU countries that banned RT and Sputnik from appearing online in the Netherlands. They're lecturing on how media freedom is a precondition for a well-functioning democratic and free society. Do they even listen to the lack of logic in what they're saying? Then you have the Twitter files, which show the government pressure to censor opponents of government policy. And ironically, Matt Taibbi, who's one of the people editing and producing documentation from the Twitter files, when he was testifying before the Congress, the Internal Revenue Service visited his home. Talk about suppression of free speech. Then we have the UN Security Council voting down the resolution to investigate the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. Is there any transparency in these investigations? Supposedly there are investigations going on. The one investigation which pointed to Biden in the U.S. by Seymour Hersh has been countered by fairy tales about a yacht with 6 people planting the explosives. A Chinese representative asked in the discussion of whether or not there would be an investigation in the UN, what is the U.S. afraid of? Well, that's a good question. Now, let me give you 2 other examples of the fraud of democracy. France, where the government of Macron personally decided to impose by diktat a so-called pension reform, which he feared would not go through the National Assembly. Spokesmen for the French government are saying this is democratic because the diktat is part of the Constitution. Well, talk about sophistry. The fact that they wouldn't allow a vote and now there are millions of people in the streets in protest shows that this is not a democratic move. Then, of course, you have Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the demagogue from way back, is trying to end the one aspect of balance of power which exists within Israel, the so-called one democratic state in West Asia. They have no constitution. They have only one legislative body, the Knesset. And the Supreme Court is the one agency, one institution, which can rule against tyranny of majority rule. What Netanyahu wants to do is change the Supreme Court, the nature of the Supreme Court, so they can't rule against him. Now, nearly 1 million people have been out in the streets in Israel. And Netanyahu has called his opponents, quote, an extremist minority willing to tear apart our country and incite civil war, unquote. That's what he's doing. That's what Netanyahu is doing by deploying police against Army Reserve members who are out in the streets protesting his so-called reform. Now, on top of this, you have one other aspect of the so-called tyranny of democracies. The transformation over the last 50 years of Western economies from those based on production of physical goods, increases in productivity, improvements in living standards, changing from that to a casino economy in which, as the bets go bad, the bettors, the speculators, are bailed out with flows of money and currency and creation of new debt by the financial institutions, the central banks, while the population is left with inflation, with a breakdown of supplies and so on. Did any citizen knowingly vote for this process of financialization? Was there any discussion? The one person I know who stood up repeatedly against this, Lyndon LaRouche, was thrown in prison because of his opposition to this policy and his alternatives that he put forward. Well, if this gives you a hint, this report of what we're facing with the so-called Summit for Democracy, I urge you to register for our conference on April 15th, the Schiller Institute conference. There'll be a link in the description page. You'll be able to participate in an actual discussion of what must be done to end this farce. Thank you for joining me today. I'll be back with an update tomorrow.